Hi everyone, welcome to today's session at the Data Platform Summit. My name is Nikita Takru and I'm a product manager in Microsoft's Azure Arc-enabled data services team. And today what we're going to be discussing in the session is Azure Arc-enabled data services. So let's dive right in. We're first going to start out by having a high-level discussion of Azure Arc as it is a family of products and services. After that, we're going to narrow down to Azure Arc-enabled data services specifically. So let's start by talking about what is Azure Arc and what are we hearing from our customers and seeing today. So one of the things that we're noticing, as we talk to these customers, is that customers' infrastructure today is spread across on-premises, multiple clouds, and what's happening is that it's getting harder and harder to manage these different resources. So some of the questions that we often hear from our customers is, how do we govern and operate in these different environments? How do we ensure security across the entire organization? At the same time, people are looking to enable developer agility and innovation. And with the regulatory environments that you have today, how do you overcome these different hurdles? So if you really look at, the customers' environments today, it's really clear that they're continuing to grow in this complexity. Applications are running across diverse infrastructure, data centers, as well as multi-cloud scenarios, multi-cloud being where you have two or more clouds. In addition to all of this, the complexity increases as teams are using different tools, different languages, different clouds. So these are some of the key areas that we have been hearing, and Microsoft Azure has been designed to help you meet these different challenges. So now let's talk about Azure Arc. Azure Arc unlocks this new hybrid scenario for customers by extending Azure services to any infrastructure. So you can now manage and operate existing and new resources consistently and at scale whenever it is hosted with Azure. Azure Arc-enabled infrastructure and Azure Arc-enabled services are two of the different approaches that we use here at Microsoft. So let's first start by talking about infrastructure. So infrastructure lets you collect your resources, inventory them. These are resources which could live outside of Azure, and you can operate them as if they were native Azure resources. You can think of this as an equivalent of an IaaS model that you get in Azure today. Now, if we go into data services, what you're getting is the flexibility to deploy fully managed Azure services from anywhere. This is the equivalent of a PaaS model that you have in Azure today. So now let's talk about within the infrastructure as a model piece. So today there are three different offerings that we have. The first one is Arc-enabled servers. This one is GA'd. We also have SQL Server on Azure Arc-enabled servers and Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes. So this means that you have existing infrastructure, which could be physical servers or virtual machines. These could be running Linux, Windows, Red Hat, or any open source system. One thing to point out is that we support all of the major popular Kubernetes offerings which are out there. And to see specifically which ones those are, you can actually check out the Microsoft documentation page, which goes over this in detail as well. So all of this can also be connected to Azure, and the way that we do this is actually by running the workloads with the Arc agent next to the workload. So this agent will then project the resources into Azure, and you can see these resources in Azure and operate them as if they were there all along. So now let's talk about each one of those three in detail, starting with Azure Arc-enabled servers. This is the most basic, level offering that you can think of. So what this is it's an agent that the customer can install on servers. These could be physical or virtual. They again can be running Windows or Linux. Once the agent is installed, then the server becomes visible in the Azure portal, just like it was in the Azure virtual machine. And what this means is that customers can put this in a resource group, you can apply tags on it, And you can also use additional Azure services on top of these servers. Customers are able to apply policies that could integrate them into, say, a security center, and they could use Azure Monitor on top of it. This goes back into giving customers a single pane of glass for viewing all of their different resources. So now on top of Arc-enabled servers, we also have a SQL Server extension today. So this extension, essentially let's talk about how it works. So customers, again, install an agent on the physical or virtual server, which could be running Windows or Linux. This can be any supported version of SQL Server 2012 or greater. This SQL Server can be on premises, at a data center, or even in another public cloud. Once the agent is there, you can actually see it on the Azure portal and put it into a resource group. This then can also be integrated with other Azure services. Ones that we hear customers are particularly interested in is the ability to run SQL assessment. So you also have that option as well. Now we have Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes. And what this is it's an agent that's installed in any certified Kubernetes cluster. Once it's installed, again, it's visible in the Azure portal. An example of one of these that you can see is you could quickly spin up an AKS cluster and then see that in the portal today. After that, you can put this into a resource group and onboard it into other Azure services like Azure Policy for Kubernetes, Azure Monitor, and Azure Defender for Kubernetes as well. The other benefit is that you can use GitOps consistently across the entire GitOps repo on premises or on Azure or even in another cloud. You're going to be getting that same experience across the board. Now let's talk about services specifically. So for customers who are looking to modernize, we also offer Azure Arc-enabled services. So what we like to say is that when you cannot move to Azure, we are bringing Azure to you. What we are doing is we're taking a platform as a service offering in Azure, like Azure SQL Managed Instance, and we're encapsulating that entire service. And the whole service is coming. So it's not just the database engine that you're getting, but you're also getting features like point-in-time restore, built-in high availability, and we're giving this to the customer to run on their specific infrastructure. So now, within services specifically, if we take a look, we have Arc-enabled application services and Arc-enabled data services. A third offering, which I don't have here on my slide, is actually also Arc-enabled machine learning. So we have those three offerings. Now what we're going to do is together, we're going to look at what each of these means in depth. So let's start with Azure Arc-enabled application services. Now you might be wondering how, all of this works. So we'll talk about that. With Azure Arc-enabled application services, you have a Kubernetes cluster. This Kubernetes cluster could be on premises. It could even be in another cloud. So when you're going in and you're deploying a web app or a logic app that is Arc-enabled, what you'll be doing is actually deploying to a custom location. A custom location is equivalent to a Kubernetes namespace for reference. And what this is doing is it makes the app service run in the customer's infrastructure. So now if we take a look at Azure Arc-enabled data services, we're doing the exact same thing here. Customers come with their Kubernetes cluster of their choice. If you want to spin one up really quickly, you can even create an AKS cluster in Azure today. So after this, what customers will do is they will deploy a data controller. Data controller is essentially a control plane which has two different connectivity modes. The directly connected mode and indirectly connected mode, which we'll go more in depth later today. Now on top of this, we have the SQL engine offerings. And the two that we have today is SQL Managed Instance and Postgres. What we're doing is we're containerizing these services and we're bringing them directly to the customer. So Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance is the same product that you have in Azure today, Postgres is a community version, which is the same product that you have in Azure today. So you're getting the same products, right, directly to you as the customer. Now let's dive a little bit deeper and discuss Azure Arc-enabled data services customer scenarios. What are we hearing today? Why are people coming to Azure Arc-enabled data services? Why are customers looking at Azure Arc? So to set the stage a little bit, it's important to realize that now we are in a hybrid world. Many customers have data centers in Azure. They have their own, data centers on premises and even in other clouds as well. So being able to reduce the cost of labor, and use these PaaS offerings both in the cloud and on premises is a big draw for customers today. Multi-cloud is becoming more and more common for customers now, if you look at the environment that we are in today. And being able to deploy a Kubernetes cluster on any cloud and in Azure, you're getting the same SQL managed instance in any public cloud on premises or in Azure, which customers really appreciate. We also enable customers to use Azure services at the edge. There are a lot of retail and manufacturing customers actually that need compute and data at their factories, but they have hundreds and thousands of locations which don't have the staff to manage all of this and the complexity that it comes with. We also have, their data sovereignty rules due to industry or governmental regulations, which is another area that Arc-enabled data services help solve the problem for. It helps you solve these regulatory challenges where your data has to, reside, say, on premises, but then you want to get these Azure benefits. Now, besides this, customers can also use, Azure PaaS services like, on premises, and they can keep their data where they want it and still have that full management experience. So that's a big one. Azure Arc gives you that single pane of glass to manage all of these diverse resources at scale. So now that we have that broad understanding of Azure Arc, let's drill down and specifically take a look at Azure Arc-enabled data services in depth and the scenarios that it opens up. One of the best pieces, and which is really important to highlight, is that customers can choose the infrastructure, which means that if you're a customer, you can provision the hardware and Kubernetes on premises or in any public cloud. Customers can also choose things like the amount and type of CPU, memory, and storage that they want to provision. This is a differentiator than, the Azure PaaS offering as well, that, admins, they're configuring Kubernetes in their way with their tools today. Now, one thing to point out is that you're not just getting the database engine or the SQL server here. You're actually getting an Azure service. What we have done is we have encapsulated all these PaaS offerings for customers and giving this full Azure service to you. What does this mean? This means you're getting automatic backups, point-in-time restore, high availability, upgrades, which means there are no major version changes, scalability, which is the same as Azure. If you need to, say, double the amount of cores or memory, you can scale up or scale down similarly. We also have a cloud billing model, which means that you pay per vCore per hour. So you're paying based on what you use. What we're doing is we're, again, containerizing these offerings and giving them to the customer to use on their infrastructure of their choice. So now let's talk about, how this all works and piece it together. So customers have their infrastructure already spun up. So it's very easy to scale up and to scale down. We make this available with a wide range of tools. Everything is Kubernetes and ARM native for customers. We provide the AZ CLI, the Azure portal, and Azure Data Studio for customers to use and manage these resources. You can pick whichever tool you want to use and which fits best. Now let's talk about the benefits that you're getting with Azure Arc-enabled data services. What is the value that we're bringing here to the customer? So first, With Azure Arc, you can now bring Azure Data Services to any infrastructure across on-premises data centers, edge, and even third-party clouds. All of this is again done using Kubernetes. And this is again on any hardware of your choice. So for customers who need to maintain data estate on-premises, you're going to gain some unique benefits for those on-premises data workloads. The first benefit is that you will always be current, meaning that updates and upgrades are fully automated and the deployment is controlled by your policy. You will get a unique cloud innovation ahead of any other hybrid cloud offerings, like for example, Evergreen SQL, which has no end of support through Azure SQL Database, and similarly for Postgres as well. Now on top of this, we also bring that cloud elasticity on premises to you. So you can optimize performance of data workloads with the ability to dynamically scale up or down or scale out without any application downtime. But besides just this, you're also connected to Azure. So if you're going to be connecting to Azure, you're going to gain, unified management as well. So just imagine and picture being able to see all of your data services running on premises alongside those running in Azure through a single pane of glass using familiar tools that you already probably are using like the Azure Portal, Azure Data Studio, and Azure CLI. So for the first time, you're really getting access to Azure's, leading security and governance capabilities too in your on-premises data workloads using things like Azure Security Center, Azure Policy, and Azure RBAC to protect your data on premises as well. Now, besides this, we also have a cloud billing model, which means that you as a customer are only paying for what you use today. Now, one thing to point out here is within data services, again, as I mentioned, we have those two SQL engine offerings, which is your Azure Arc-enabled SQL managed instance and Azure Arc-enabled Postgres. Our SQL managed instance on Arc is GA'd in both service tiers, the general purpose and business critical. We'll go later more in depth on those today. And one other piece which is really important to point out is that we support different connectivity modes, meaning we have directly connected mode and indirectly connected mode. We will talk more about what each of these are today, but at a high level, directly connected mode means, I want to be connected to Azure at all times, and indirectly mode means I can't be connected to Azure at all times, but I still want to access all of these benefits. And then again, we support all of the popular Kubernetes offerings, and we do this on any hardware that the customer brings. Now let's dive into and talk about the Azure Arc-enabled data services architecture at a high level. And let's see how really all of these pieces start to come together and fit into the big picture. So the very first step that you will go through when deploying data services is that first you want to deploy a Kubernetes cluster on any infrastructure of your choice. So customers will come bringing their, Kubernetes cluster. If you want to create one and try this out really quickly, you can spin up a AKS cluster from the Azure portal very quickly and get that up and running. So one thing to point out here is we do support the majority of Kubernetes offerings and distributions which are out there, and details of this can be found in our Microsoft documentation page as well. So now that I have my Kubernetes cluster up and running, what comes next? The next step really comes with the Azure Arc Data Controller. So what you're going to want to do is you want to deploy a data controller, and the way that you can do this is you can either deploy it from the Microsoft Container Registry or even from your own private repository as well. Now you might be wondering, what is this data controller? So let's talk about it. The data controller essentially acts as the brains behind data services. So when you're deploying an Azure Arc Data Controller, what you're doing is you're actually getting the built-in functionality, which I was talking about earlier. So you're getting built-in monitoring, built-in patching, built-in scaling, etc. In addition to all of this, you also get an Azure Arc integration if you deploy in the directly connected mode. The Azure Arc integration lets you connect your data services to Azure, which therefore then unlocks additional functionality. You can then do things like deploying from portal directly, being able to delete. You can also take advantage of Azure services like monitoring. Customers can even optionally upload their metrics and logs to Azure as well. You can upload your backups to Azure for long-term retention. So all of this is really possible through that data controller. So now let's recap what we've done so far. 1, we have our Kubernetes cluster up and running. And 2, we now have our data controller up and running. So now after this, what we can do is we can deploy the database engines. There are 2 options as of today in data services, and those are your SQL managed instance and Postgres. You can actually deploy either of these through the Azure portal, through the AZ CLI, or even through Azure Data Studio. So again, these are very familiar tools that you've probably already used, so nothing new in terms of being able to have that deployment. We have AZ CLI, which is, if you want to scale up very quickly and automate the process that you can use. We also have the GUI tools available, which is the Azure portal and Azure Data Studio. And that's the entire deployment process at a high level. So you have, again, Kubernetes cluster up and running, step 1. Step 2 is you have the data controller, for which we have 2 different connectivity modes, the directly connected mode and the indirectly connected mode. And right after this, we'll go into what each of those mean. And the third piece is then you have your engine offerings, being SQL managed instance or Postgres, that you can run on top of that as well. So now that we have this high level understanding of the architecture, let's dive into the connectivity modes and what that really means. So within data services, we offer 2 different connectivity modes for customers. We have the directly connected mode and the indirectly connected mode. So what directly connected mode means is you want to be fully connected with the Azure portal at all times. In this scenario, you can actually auto-integrate with other features due to that connection with Azure. So you can integrate with features like Azure Monitor. Now we understand that some customers may not be able to have their databases be connected to Azure at all times. And that's the reasoning and motivation behind why we have the indirectly connected mode. Indirectly connected mode is for data centers or for regions which cannot have this direct connection to Azure. A really good way to understand indirectly connected mode is actually to take a look at, a customer example. So one of the customers, SKF, they have actually data centers in regions which cannot have, this direct connection to Azure. So they run Arc data services in factory locations all across the world. And some of these locations, they have limited bandwidth and they can't be connected at all times to Azure. So this is a really good use case for indirectly connected mode. Similarly, IoT, edge devices, are also good candidates for the indirectly connected mode scenario as well. Now, customers, on the other hand, who want to see current up-to-date real-time inventory metrics, they will use directly connected mode, as that's a better choice in that case. Also, for customers who want to use additional Azure features like security, Azure monitoring, Azure Defender, this is also a good case for directly connected mode. And what you'll see here in this slide is the different features which are offered with both modes. So you can see on the leftmost piece the built-in capabilities like your automatic HA, DR, elastic scalability, billing, monitoring, authentication, to name a few, and you can see the rest here. But what you'll notice is that between both indirectly and directly connected mode, you're really getting those same built-in capabilities and those same features. The one main difference, as you can see, in the bottom, is Azure Security Services. This one you have in the directly connected mode, but not in indirectly connected mode. And the reason is because of the use case, right? Since you have that direct connection to Azure in direct mode, you're able to access those services as well. Whereas in indirect mode, since you're not connected to Azure, that's not possible, as that's the whole point of indirectly connected mode. That's not to say there isn't security. We do have, security too, like features like AD and whatnot as well. But what you really want you to take away from this is that regardless of what mode you're in, you're getting those built-in capabilities across the board as a customer. So now if we go ahead and we dive right in, what you'll notice here is that you're using familiar tools to connect and manage all of these different resources. So once you have your data controller set up, you have your managed instance or Postgres deployed, there are not any new tools you need to learn. Essentially, you can think of it as another SQL Server instance. Postgres and managed instance, their tools are very similar to what you're already using today. So think of it as just a little connection string to get everything up and running. You still have your AZ CLI, your Azure portal, and Azure Data Studio as well for deployment and managing that. So now let's actually go into and take an in-depth look at one of the two engine offerings, which is Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance. The second offering is Postgres, but we'll go into depth on Managed Instance today, and we'll talk about, what are you getting with SQL MI? So in this slide, I have a feature comparison for SQL Server across all of the different setups. As you may notice, in the leftmost column is all of your built-in capabilities, like database security features, column store, intelligent query processing, partitioning, replication, and so on and so forth. Now, what you'll notice is that in the middle three columns, these are your comparison metrics. So the very first one, SQL Server. In this one, what you'll notice is this is SQL Server on premises, which is something that you may actually have today. Now on the rightmost column where you see Azure SQL Managed Instance, this is what you may have in, Azure SQL MI today. But the middle column really represents Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance, and this is a blend of the two, as you can see. But what you can see across the board, regardless of which of the three you were in, is that you're getting the same, feature metrics across the board, and they're really on par for the built-in capabilities among all three of these. So now let's talk about SQL Managed Instance and the different service tier offerings which are there for customers today. So we have two. We have a general purpose service tier, and we have a business critical service tier as well. So for general purpose, that one has been GA'd as of last year, and business critical recently was GA'd this year as well. So both services are GA'd. The primary differences between the two we will discuss and talk about, but really it comes down to some of the feature sets. So what you'll notice is that general purpose is equivalent to a standard edition, and standard has limits on things like CPU, memory. Now, what you are getting in both of these is you actually get something that we like to call high availability. And this is something that you're getting from Kubernetes. So what does this mean? Let's break it down a little, as high availability is a key difference between both general purpose and business critical. So you are given, high availability in Kubernetes. And what this means is that if you have a node or a pod that crashes, Kubernetes will actually handle this, and it will reattach the storage and your apps will connect to that new node. During this period of time when Kubernetes is trying to repair itself, there may actually be a brief downtime. If this is not acceptable to you as a customer, then you should choose the business critical service tier. If it's okay to have that, then general purpose may be fine for your specific scenario. So how does business critical offer, that no downtime in that scenario? In the business critical service tier, what we do is we offer a higher level of availability. So in addition to what Kubernetes is already providing you with, we're also deploying an always-on availability group when you deploy the managed instance. And what this means is you're going to get 2 to 3 copies of your data, and they will always be kept in sync. So in this scenario, if a node or pod crashes, there will be no downtime. So that's another differentiator between the business critical and general purpose for high availability. Now, another thing to point out is that for business critical, there are no limits. Additionally, if you want to go in, say, to the Azure portal, or you want to quickly test and run some of these things as a customer, we do have dev test, pricing at no cost for if you want to quickly deploy and see how all of this gets up and running. Now let's dive into, high availability more in details. So general purpose high availability, as I was talking about earlier, is provided by Kubernetes, redeploying the pod if there was a failure. Again, this can take a minute or two to deploy that pod, so you might have application downtime. Now, recovery happens with something that we call point-in-time restore. Backups and restore also happen the same way in Arc-enabled SQL managed instance and in Azure. Now, high availability is provided in a contained availability group for the business critical service tier. And in this scenario, you can actually point and tell what storage you want to use for Kubernetes. In business critical, you also can specify 2 or 3 replicas as well. And again, you're having the same point in time restore for this service tier 2. And both general purpose and business critical have Azure's failover groups as distributed availability groups. So with this being said, we're now going to go into the second portion of today, which is doing a demo. So now you have a pretty good understanding of how all of these different tools work. But what's really great is to actually see all of this in action. So the demo that we are going to go through together today will be, I will have an AKS cluster pre-configured. So this is a Kubernetes cluster. This is a prerequisite, so you come with this before you can deploy data services. So we'll take a look at that AKS cluster together in the Azure portal. After that, we're going to deploy directly connected mode data controller in the Azure portal. We'll also use some kubectl commands to see how you can manage and access all of this while it's happening. After this, we're going to deploy a SQL managed instance in the business critical service tier as well. And you'll get a chance to see the differences between general purpose and business critical. Finally, we're going to connect to the data controller in Azure Data Studio as well. So you can see how all of this works across the tools. We'll take a look at the AZ CLI, we'll take a look at the Azure portal, and we'll take a look at Azure Data Studio. And we'll really cover the main pieces here, which is the Kubernetes cluster, the data controller, and deploying one of those engine offerings, which in this case will do SQL managed instance. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the demo now. Now we can go ahead and get started with the demo. So what you will notice here is that I'm in the Azure portal. So what you'll do is you can, create a resource group, and inside of that resource group, what you're going to want to have and come bringing is a Kubernetes cluster. So if you can see here, I have a Kubernetes cluster up and running. This is an AKS cluster I created. It's called Direct Mode Cluster. And this is the cluster that we're going to use to now configure our data controller and also our SQL managed instance on top of that. So coming with your Kubernetes cluster is really step 1. Now that we have the AKS cluster up and running, one thing important to note once you create it is you're going to want to actually connect to that cluster as well. So just make sure you're on the right cluster context. But okay, we have the cluster. Now let's talk about the data controller piece. So what you can do is you can go inside of Azure. You can just search in the portal for Azure Arc Data Controller. Go ahead and select that. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to hit create. When you hit create, what will happen is you will be prompted with the 2 connectivity mode options, directly connected mode, indirectly connected mode. For the purposes of today's demo, we're going to use directly connected mode because we want to be connected to Azure and see how all of that works. After this, you can go ahead and fill out the information which they need here. So what you'll do is you will connect to your subscription. Within the subscription, please pick your resource group, and then you will be prompted to name your data controller. So you can name it anything that you want. I will just call mine for testing purposes, and then you'll go into the custom location. So custom location, again, is equivalent to a Kubernetes namespace. So what we can do is we can create a new one. We can call it direct location. And you want to actually connect that with a cluster. So I'm going to connect this with my AKS cluster that I had come with pre-configured, and you can go ahead and create that. Additionally, you will have a Kubernetes configuration option. So here what you can do is you can actually create a custom template if you want, and you want to put in, your Docker information, your credentials. This is definitely an option that we have for customers. I'm going to go ahead and use premium storage. I'll leave it with the pre-configured options. And then here, what it will ask you for is if you want to have metrics and logs, then you can actually create the username and password to access all of that information. Again, these were all of the parameters needed, which were required for data controller creation. So now that we have this up and running, I'm just going to continue onwards. Metrics and logs, again, this is optional. So if you don't want to enable it, you can proceed without doing so. So let's say for the sake of this, I do not want to have that. After this, you have the ability to add tags also if you want to add it. And then what you'll do is you will actually create the data controller. It will show you all of the details for reviewing and creating, and then you can just go ahead and press create, after which the data controller deployment will be initialized, and we can take a look at how this looks together. So now if you want to actually go ahead and track that data controller's creation process, you can use kubectl command. So you can do kubectl get data controllers -a, and this will get all of the data controllers that you have. And it will basically tell you the namespace you created, the name of the data controller, and the state. So in this case, as you can see, the data controller we created is in the ready state. The ready state means that the full deployment process for the data controller has been completed. So if you want to see that and you want to actually hop back to the Azure portal, I have this one up for the purposes of the demo. It will take a couple of minutes for the data controller to be up and running, but what you can see is here you can also see that status. In the ready state, it will tell you the connectivity mode, the custom location and namespace associated with it, and you can access all these different features for your data controller. What this enables is additional features like upgrade management, Active Directory, and so on and so forth. But we will stop here at this point for the data controller in directly connected mode as it's up and running. And now what we're going to look is, now that we have our AKS cluster, our data controller in directly connected mode, how do we create a SQL managed instance now on top of it? And that's the next piece we're going to do. Now the next step is we can hop over to the Azure portal, can go ahead and type in SQL managed instance Azure Arc, click that. You'll come to this screen. Just like the data controller, you can press create. You'll be prompted with the different fields to fill out. So for example, you'll put in your subscription information, your resource group information. You can call your SQL managed instance whatever you would like. You can also link it to that custom location that we previously had as well. And then you can pick the service type if you want this or this, and then for compute and storage. I'm going to pause here. This is where you can pick the service tier. So general purpose or high availability for business critical. That's where the difference is for HA. So if you want to try out business critical for development use only, this is the case where you can actually pick your replicas. You can pick 2 or 3 replicas, which is the difference than general purpose, where if you hop over here, you only have that one replica. But because in business critical, we offer that higher level of availability, you have this option and can configure readable secondaries as well on top of that. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and keep all of this information. And then again, if you want to create the account information, that is also an option. And then you have a choice to also enable AD authentication here. And if you do want to enable AD authentication, all you have to do is connect it with your ADC, so your AD connector, and those required information. For the purposes of this demo, we won't configure that, but that's another piece that you can also enable Active Directory in that feature here too. So after this, you again can add tags as well if you would like. Otherwise, you will just have a summary of your resources and it will run a quick validation and you can go ahead and create your SQL MIA instance. And then again, for the purposes of this demo, I have created that SQL MIA instance, so you can go ahead and view it in the Azure portal as well. It will take a few minutes to configure. Once again, once you have your SQL MIA instance ready to go, what you can also do is you have options for features like upgrade management. So if you need to perform an upgrade for your SQL MIA, that's also possible. In this situation, you can see I'm currently up to date, but if an upgrade was available, I would see it here and I could upgrade now through this method. I could upgrade through CLI as well. And then you also have options for alerts, for metrics, for logs. So all of these options are also available for customers. Now let's look at the tool Azure Data Studio as well, in addition to the Azure portal. So here I've opened up Azure Data Studio, and what we're going to do is we're going to connect the data controller that we've already connected to in the Azure portal to Azure Data Studio. So let's take a look at how to do that. So right here, you'll notice a couple of things. First of all, we have this, Azure Arc controller section here in Azure Data Studio. So if you go ahead and you click that, you can actually connect to a controller that you already have. So we had created a directly connected mode data controller in the Azure portal today. What we're going to do is now we're going to connect to that data controller in Azure Data Studio. Additionally, if you had already also created that data controller in the AZ CLI, the process of connection will still work the same, as you're just using some required parameters. So it'll ask you for your namespace. So I'll put in the namespace for that data controller. It will take your kubeconfig file path and it will pick the cluster context. So this is the cluster, the AKS cluster in my case that I had created and linked that data controller to. So in this case, it's direct mode cluster, but if you had multiple clusters, it would show up here in Azure Data Studio and you could select the one that it was associated with. So these are the only parameters you need to put into Azure Data Studio. And once you do so, you can actually hit connect. And what Azure Data Studio will do is it will find all of that information based on the parameters you gave, like the namespace, the kubeconfig file, and your cluster, and it's actually going to connect to that data controller. So now you can see that our data controller popped up here. And if I click that arrow underneath, what it is looking for is if there are any SQL managed instances which were associated with that data controller. So I have quite a few here, but if you want to look within one of those, what you can actually do is right click, press manage, and it will pop up a similar dashboard to what you have previously seen in the Azure portal. So very similarly, you can access all of that information here, and you can even again have your tabs like upgrade management, if you have any upgrades, backups, and things along those lines as well. So this is how a quick and simple Azure Data Studio connection works. Azure Data Studio is particularly useful for the situation of indirectly connected mode, where if you're a customer and you can't be directly connected to Azure, then you're most likely not going to be, going to the Azure portal since you don't have that connection. So you can't actually use the Azure portal in that sense. Your only tool options are AZ CLI or Azure Data Studio. So we do have this tool for viewing as well. So overall, this is pretty much the main piece of the demo that I wanted to show you. But while we're in Azure Data Studio, I'll also show you if you wanted to create a data controller or even a SQL managed instance or Postgres instance, you can even do that through Azure Data Studio. All you have to do is go to Connections, New Deployment. And what you'll notice here is we have Azure Arc Data Controller. You can very easily select that option, go through the wizard experience, and this will create a data controller for you this way too. We won't do it right now, but I just wanted to point that out. Similarly, I'll just point out that if you had gone through this method and you wanted to create a SQL MIA instance, we did it through Portal, but the experience is very similar here. You just pick SQL Managed Instance Azure Arc, two-step process of putting in the required parameters, hit finish, and then it will be deployed for you. So as you can see, we took a look at all three of the tools today. We went through the deployment process in the Azure portal. We connected to Azure Data Studio, and you can use the AZ CLI as well. We use kubectl to view the data controller and check the state, but that is also another option. So we have all of the major tools for customers to use, which they're already familiar with for configuration as well. So thank you so much for listening to the demo. We'll hop back over to the next part, but I hope this gives you a good idea of how all three of these tools work and how data services can be deployed in that full lifecycle scenario. Now that we've taken a look at the demo for SQL Managed Instance, and you've learned so much today in the presentation in regards to Azure Arc-enabled data services, what I'd like to say is there's clearly no reason not to get started trying things out, playing with the tools, learning about them. So here are some resources to get started. I do want to point out that we have jumpstarts and technical documentation at Microsoft Docs. Definitely check those out. They're great resources if you want to learn about data services, get up and running, really try out and understand how some of these pieces work all together. And it's been wonderful being at the Data Platform Summit today. I really wanted to thank everyone for joining the presentation, and if you have any questions, feel free to add that in the chat, or we'll have time at the end as well to answer them. I hope you all learned something. It was fantastic talking to everyone about Azure Arc-enabled data services. Thank you.